The typo that started it all. Hey guys. Tonight we're going to ease into a tale so hilariously bureaucratic, so delightfully slow-paced, that your brain might decide to file itself under drowsy before we even reach the first court hearing. This isn't about a bloody war or a scandalous royal affair. No, tonight's adventure begins with something far more treacherous, a simple typo in a calendar. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time down below so I can see how far this sleepy little corner of the internet reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're in a chilly stone-walled office in the year 1582. Ink bottles crowd a wooden desk, parchment curls up at the edges, and candlelight flickers like it's been told a very dull joke. A monk, or maybe a clerk with thinning hair and a slightly crooked spine, is hunched over a calendar sheet. He dabs his quill into the ink, squints at the page, and writes out the date, but just one digit off. Perhaps a 3 instead of a 4. Maybe he forgets to drop the extra X in a Roman numeral. Whatever it is, this single slip of the quill gets printed, distributed, and eventually filed into the very archives that legal clerks, tax agents, and government scribes would rely on for years to come. Seems harmless, right? Except it wasn't, because this tiny mistake gets absorbed into the official state records, and from there, the chaos starts. See, this wasn't just any old calendar. This was a transitional period, when much of Europe was switching from the Julian calendar to the newly proposed Gregorian one. The Julian calendar had been in use for over 1,600 years, but it wasn't very precise. It gained about 11 minutes each year, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that by the 16th century, the calendar was off by 10 full days. Easter was drifting further into summer, and harvest festivals started showing up after the crops were already picked. So Pope Gregory XIII, with the help of scholars and mathematicians, devised a fix: drop 10 days from the year, and adjust leap years slightly to keep things on track. The Gregorian calendar would become our modern system, but here's the issue: transitioning wasn't smooth. Not everyone adopted it at once. Catholic countries like Italy, Spain, and Portugal made the leap in 1582. Protestant countries like England waited until 1752, and the Eastern Orthodox world, much later still. So what do you get when different governments, businesses, and legal systems operate on different calendars? Absolute confusion. Now, our typo, it happened during this chaos. A clerical error in a legal document dated an agreement, using a phantom day, a date that was technically skipped in the new Gregorian transition. The document, which concerned a land grant and a disputed tax debt between two minor nobles in the German states, recorded an event as occurring on October 11, 1582. Problem was, under the Gregorian reform, October 5th through 14th didn't exist that year. The Catholic regions had simply fast-forwarded, but the document said the meeting happened on the 11th, so did it happen? Was it valid? Should it be recognized? A normal person might shrug and say, just pick the closest date, but the legal world, oh no. They did what they do best, they argued. For decades, this is where things get juicy, because the debate wasn't just about the land grant, it became a precedent-setting case that influenced how legal dates were recognized across borders. And as word of the strange loophole spread, other people started noticing calendar problems in their paperwork. Suddenly, courtrooms were flooded with challenges: missed rent deadlines, invalid marriage dates, expired patents that weren't actually expired. One of the earliest ripple effects: a mill owner who was sued for breach of contract because he allegedly failed to deliver timber by October 10, 1582. He argued that since the 10th no longer technically existed, he couldn't be penalized for missing it. The opposing lawyer countered that since the contract was written under the Julian system, it should still stand. The judge, probably rubbing his temples with both hands, postponed the hearing for a year. That's right, delayed an entire year while clerks tried to make a conversion chart for all disputed dates. It only got messier from there. A more fringe but equally baffling case emerged from a tiny parish in Flanders, where a local monk disputed the burial date on a tombstone because it conflicted with liturgical records. The monk insisted that a nobleman could not possibly have been buried on October 13, since that day, too, had been swallowed by the calendar shift. And if the tombstone was wrong, then according to arcane inheritance laws his heir might be illegitimate. That's right. A typo potentially threatened to unseat an entire family line. Scholars today still debate whether the monk was sincerely concerned with accuracy or simply playing political chess for his favored candidate. This brings us to our first open scholarly debate: Who bears responsibility when law and time collide? Was it the fault of the printer, the scribe, the governing council that failed to offer standardized training during the calendar switch? Historians, they argue over whether this legal chaos was inevitable or whether it could have been prevented with a more coordinated rollout. Some even claim the church wanted this confusion to reinforce its role as arbiter of time and season. That may sound like a conspiracy theory, but it's rooted in real scholarly papers. And then, there's the human side of it all, because behind every typo was a person. A clerk working long hours, eyes tired from flickering candlelight. A translator, trying to interpret Latin across changing political lines. A judge relying on records copied 3 times before they reached his desk. You picture them now sitting at their heavy wooden tables, surrounded by inkpots and the smell of melting wax, scratching their heads over whether October 11th actually happened. And as absurd as it sounds, you realize something strangely beautiful. We humans tried to tame time itself and, of course, messed it up with a typo. But we also kept trying. We litigated it, argued over it, corrected it, forgot it, and rediscovered it centuries later. A single slip of the pen sent echoes through law books, courtrooms, and even graveyards. And now here we are, lying back in the quiet of the night, listening to the waves of history lap gently at the strange, rocky shores of timekeeping. Don't worry, you wouldn't have survived this legal maze either. Not without a nap, a lawyer, and a really good calendar conversion table. When a lease expired before it began, you strolled into a cold, narrow chamber layered with the scent of damp parchment, old ink, and the faintest aroma of desperate lawyer's office in mid-17th century England. There's a strange energy in the air, like someone just realized something horrifyingly dull but also strangely catastrophic. On the desk is a lease contract, official, legally binding, complete with red wax seal and dramatic curlicues, but as your eyes skim down to the date, something is off. The tenant's lease term starts on February 29th, 1700. Now, if you're thinking, wait a minute, was 1700 a leap year? Congratulations. You're more attentive than the clerk who drafted it. Here's the kicker. Under the Julian calendar, 1700 would have been a leap year, but under the newly adopted Gregorian calendar, 1700 was not. That's because in the Gregorian system, years divisible by 100 are not leap years unless they're also divisible by 400. So 1700, no extra day in February, no February 29th, no legally viable lease. And just like that, a contract evaporated into thin air. Welcome to the legal nightmare where time itself can void your property rights. You wouldn't survive this paperwork jungle unless you carried a calendar, a lawyer, and maybe a philosopher just to interpret it all. This wasn't a one-time blunder either. Records show multiple instances of leases, wills, and even marriage certificates being signed or enacted on non-existent dates, particularly during calendar transition years or leap year confusion. One particularly fascinating case unfolded in the Scottish Highlands. A shepherd leased grazing land from a noble family with a contract beginning on March 1st, 1700, and ending upon the morrow following the last day of the second month in the year of our Lord, 1700. At first glance, everything seemed correct. But then came the argument, did second month refer to February or April? See, not everyone agreed on what constituted the first month. Some cultures and religious orders still used March as the beginning of the year, so to them, April was a second month. To others it was plainly February. The contract didn't specify, and the tenant refused to vacate the land on the date the landlord believed was correct. This conflict dragged on for years. No one could conclusively prove when the lease was supposed to end. Eventually, the sheep outlived the contract. And this opens our mainstream historical fact. For centuries, New Year's Day wasn't universally on January 1st in England, for example. March 25th was the official start of the year until 1752. So when people in 1701 wrote February 20th, 1700, they weren't making a mistake. They were using the calendar system that governed their legal and social lives. But combine that with leap year confusion, overlapping systems, and regional differences. You get chaos that even judges couldn't untangle. Let's throw in a quirky, lesser-known fact while we're here. The phrase "not worth the paper it's printed on" actually gained traction in legal circles during this time. Contracts, treaties, and court orders were being challenged based purely on calendar inaccuracies. Imagine spending months negotiating a business agreement only for it to be dismissed because the start date doesn't exist. That's how powerful time was and still is. Scholars today still debate a specific lease dispute from 1712 involving a brewery in Amsterdam. The lease's expiration clause was written under the Julian system but enforced in a jurisdiction that had already adopted the Gregorian one. The date, once again, fell into a gray area. Historians can't agree on whether the brewery's rent increase was legal or not. Some argued that the change was a deliberate manipulation and early example of legal exploitation via calendar ambiguity. Others believe it was an honest clerical oversight, exacerbated by poor communication between local and imperial courts. This scholarly debate brings us to a strange truth. Even systems designed to bring order like calendar scans sow disorder when they're misunderstood or mistranslated. Imagine being the poor tenant arguing that he shouldn't be evicted because his lease technically hasn't started yet, and the landlord insists it's already expired. Both are right, both are wrong. Everyone is confused. You wouldn't survive this lease loophole unless you could time travel, or better yet, freeze time until lawyers reached consensus. And don't think only peasants and local merchants got caught in this chaos. Nobility suffered too. In 1723, an earl's widow filed suit claiming she was being denied her widow's pension because the date of her husband's death fell during a leap day era. The pension board rejected her claim, citing insufficient chronological proof of bereavement. Let that absurd phrase wash over you. Chronological proof of bereavement. She lost income because no one could prove her husband's death that occurred on a legal day. This is the tragicomic world of post-typo law. Documents, dates, and declarations folded into themselves like bad origami. Bureaucrats scrambled to issue retroactive corrections. Printers were quietly told to revise records without telling anyone. But the damage was done. Time itself had become a legal argument, and every misplaced digit on a dusty contract echoed through people's homes, courtrooms, and lives. As you lie there, the soft hum of history in your ears, you might feel a small flutter of appreciation for how neatly your phone handles dates. But imagine, for a moment, living in a world where your birthday, your rent, your very legal existence, might rest on whether someone in a stone chamber wrote for instead of sleep well. At least your lease is probably valid. The war of the missing week you wake up, or at least you think you do, to the gentle scrape of quills, the soft rustling of parchment, and the hollow thud of old boots pacing across wooden floorboards. The air smells faintly of old ink, wax, seals, and that mysterious library dust scent that seems to have existed long before the first book ever opened. It's the year 1752. And you've found yourself sitting in the middle of a town hall in England where the people are upset. Not about a new tax, not about a royal scandal, but about time. More specifically, they're furious that it's September 14th, but yesterday it was September 2nd. That's right, September 3rd through the 13th never happened. They were erased, vanished, gone like a forgotten dream. And no one is happy about it. You wouldn't survive this kind of chronological chaos. Not unless you could convince yourself that losing 11 whole days from your life was no big deal. Welcome to the Gregorian calendar reform. Part 2. See, while much of Catholic Europe adopted the new calendar back in 1582, Protestant England wasn't so keen. They refused to follow a papal decree, even if it meant their seasons, feasts, and paperwork drifted ever further from continental consistency. But by the mid-18th century, the difference had become too large to ignore. England was 11 days out of sync with the rest of Europe, making diplomacy, trade, and even travel absurdly difficult. So Parliament passed the Calendar New Style Act of 1750, and 2 years later, those pesky 11 days were removed from the calendar. The British public's reaction, less than chilled. Many believed their lives were being shortened. Others worried that wages, rents, and interest payments would be unfairly affected. Pamphlets accused the government of theft. Crowds reportedly chanted, "Give us our 11 days." Whether or not actual riots occurred is up for debate. First scholarly disagreement tonight. Some historians argue that reports of riots were exaggerated or fictional, perhaps invented later for dramatic effect. Others insist that small-scale unrest did break out in places like Bristol, with local judges needing to step in to calm anxious workers who demanded to be paid for days that, legally speaking, had never existed. That's the open question. Did the British actually riot over missing time, or did the idea of such a reaction simply capture the public imagination? Either way, the confusion was very real. Clergy had to rewrite service schedules. Farmers grumbled about planting and harvesting times, and legal cases. A glorious mess. Imagine someone with a court date on September 10th. They show up, the courthouse is locked. The clerk shrugs and says, that day no longer exists. This gives us our mainstream historical fact. England officially adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752. dropping 11 days from the month of September. The shift aligned Britain with most of Europe but created widespread public confusion and logistical headaches. And now, a fringe but fascinating wrinkle. A few superstitious folks believed those 11 days weren't just lost, they were stored, a sort of mystical backlog of time that might one day be unleashed. Writers and local preachers wove tales of a phantom fortnight lurking just out of reach. One especially vivid local legend claimed that the souls of the dead from those missing days wandered restlessly, denied their proper time to pass. A bit of folklore, yes, but a testament to how deeply the change affected people's perception of time and reality. Not to be left behind, landlords and tenants dove into a quagmire of recalculations. Rents were typically due by the quarter days Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas, and Christmas. But what happens when one of those dates disappears? Debates swirled over whether rent was owed in full or prorated. One court clerk in York reportedly spent months recalculating annual leases to account for temporarily incomplete intervals. Can you imagine that job title? Assistant Registrar of Temporarily Incomplete Intervals. That's not a Monty Python sketch, that's your Tuesday afternoon. In 1752, one legal scholar proposed a compromise that nearly made it into law: adjust the entire year to be 354 days long, just for one cycle, and restart proper counting in 1753. But Parliament refused, worried it would create a precedent for rewriting time at whim. Good call, but we weren't done yet. Religious observances. It became a tangled web. The feast of St. Michael Michaelmas traditionally fell on September 29th, but with shifting calendars, questions arose. Should it be celebrated according to the old reckoning or the new? Some churches, confused, held services on both days. One congregation in Norfolk reportedly held 3 separate Michaelmas feasts just to be safe. Scholars even argued over Easter, which already had a complicated calculation system based on the lunar calendar. With the date change, clergymen found themselves locked in passionate debates about the correct resurrection anniversary. Who knew rearranging a few days could bring about theological disputes, legal nightmares, and folk legends of lost souls? And yet, all of it happened. Some modern historians view this moment as a fascinating collision between ordinary life and abstract systems. Most people lived simple lives, marked by sunrises and harvests, not by papal decrees and astronomical alignments. And yet suddenly, time itself became malleable. Days could be erased. Your birthday might vanish. A court case could evaporate. You might owe rent for a time period that technically didn't exist. You can feel your mind drifting now, floating gently among the phantom days of September. Think of 11 soft, blank spaces in the calendar, empty pockets of time, unburdened by events, arguments, or chores. For all their bureaucratic confusion, maybe those missing days now live on somewhere in the imagination, quiet and undisturbed. And as your eyes grow heavy, remember this: you survived the war of the missing week simply by lying still. Not bad, time traveler. The phantom feast, and the 13th month debitor walking now, slowly, your feet brushing against mossy cobblestones in a village square that seems trapped somewhere between logic and folklore. It's chilly, but not from the air, from the eerie feeling that this place is celebrating something that shouldn't exist. People bustle about preparing for what they call the Feast of 2nd October. Candles flicker in windows, bunting flutters from weather-warped rooftops. A fiddler tunes an instrument that sounds slightly off key, as though it's struggling to remember which day it's meant to perform. You ask someone what the occasion is, and they whisper, it's the Lost Feast. We hold it for the days we never got now. Logically, you know this can't be official. No historian remembers a sanctioned holiday for calendar casualties, but this this has a strange logic of its own, a community ritual honoring a collective confusion. You wouldn't survive this village unless you had a calendar and a compass, and maybe a historian with a candle to guide you through the fog of forgotten feasts. This celebration is fictional, of course, but the emotions are rooted in a very real phenomenon: the chaos and public bewilderment surrounding the calendar shift, which left more than just paperwork and disarray, altered cultural rhythms. This brings us to our mainstream historical fact. Many regions, particularly rural ones, continued using the old-style calendar long after it was officially replaced. In parts of the British countryside, especially where education was limited, entire communities still observed saints' days, feast dates, and even agricultural cycles according to the Julian calendar well into the 19th century. This wasn't stubbornness, it was continuity. People didn't necessarily trust city decrees about invisible days. Why change the dates your ancestors had honored for generations just because someone in London said so? That tension between official time and lived time created a unique cultural dissonance. And here's where it gets even stranger. A little-known proposal in the 1840s suggested the idea of standardizing global time by adding a 13th month to the calendar. Yes, really. The so-called International Fixed Calendar was devised by Moses B. Cotsworth and later championed by George Eastman, founder of Kodak. The idea was to divide the year into 13 months of 28 days each, with one year day that existed outside of months to reset everything cleanly. Supporters argued it would simplify business, payrolls, and scheduling. But critics feared the loss of traditional feast days, seasonal shifts, and most interestingly the spiritual balance of time. To some, 13 months sounded cursed. The fringe fact. Eastman implemented the 13-month calendar inside his own company for decades. Kodak employees worked, scheduled meetings, and processed pay according to this altered temporal rhythm while the rest of the world trudged along in 12-month increments. For Kodak, July 28th might fall on a Wednesday every year, perfectly aligned. For the rest of us, time remained wonderfully and infuriatingly irregular. That brings us to a curious scholarly debate. Should we measure time based on natural rhythms, solstices, harvests, or mathematical uniformity in the 20th century, as time zones were formalized and computers began handling date functions? Scholars return to this ancient problem. Is the calendar supposed to reflect nature or control it? Anthropologists studying pre-colonial African and Asian societies noted how many ancient calendars were deeply tied to astronomy, agriculture, and ritual, not corporate logic. Others argue that industrial societies required strict, standardized time to function. Factories can't afford to wait for the moon's approval. Still, the tension remains, and it's no wonder the common people centuries ago and even now feel a bit alienated when time is treated more like a spreadsheet than a cycle. You're still in the village square as this scholarly storm swirls in the background. A child hands you a small buntwise baked, strangely soft, marked with the number 13 for the lost month. She says with a smile, and skips off. You bite into the bun. It's warm and strange, and you can't tell whether this is a dream or a deep truth. The celebration reaches its peak with a lantern release. Dozens of tiny flames rise into the night, flickering like forgotten dates, drifting back toward the stars. And in this sleepy reverie, you understand something timeless. People don't just keep time, they feel it. They grieve its absences, celebrate its quirks, and sometimes, in villages you'll never find on a map, they invent their own feasts, just to fill in the blanks. You lie back on a patch of grass at the edge of the celebration. A fiddler plays something that's almost a lullaby, and you start to wonder, not for the first time, whether some days disappear not because of typos or treaties, but because the world needs a little mystery to stay soft around the edges. Sleep well. Somewhere, someone is baking a bun for a feast that never existed, but still matters. The lawyer who sued the sun. You stir again, just slightly, as the flickering lantern light fades and is replaced by the dim golden haze of a rising sun, though, oddly enough, everyone around you seems irritated by it. You sit up, and now you're in an old courtroom, the air stuffy with heat and the smell of ink-stained parchment. The judge looks exasperated. A man in an ill-fitting wig is waving a calendar above his head like it's a holy relic, and across from him a clerk appears to be sweating over 2 columns of numbers that don't agree. The issue, whether or not the sun committed an act of calendar fraud. No, seriously, this courtroom is debating time itself, and you're watching a legal drama unfold over the tiniest detail in a clerical document. And if you're wondering, yes, you'd absolutely be found guilty of contempt here if you asked the wrong question about leap years. You wouldn't survive this type of hearing unless you'd memorize the entire evolution of calendar law from Julius Caesar to the House of Lords. Welcome to the wild world of time-based litigation, where a single typo, the sun's refusal to behave exactly as expected, can lead to lawsuits that last decades. Our mainstream historical fact is this: calendar errors have caused real legal disputes in Britain, the US, and beyond. One famous example occurred in early 20th century England, where a legal will was dated February 29th, in a year that wasn't a leap year. The courts spent weeks trying to determine whether the document was valid or void. In another case, a marriage certificate filed in a region using a different calendar system led to arguments over whether a couple had ever been officially married at all. But the most bizarre of these lawsuits are the ones that sit at the intersection of science, law, and belief, where people sue not other people, but systems themselves. In 1907, a French farmer actually tried to sue his local government for changing the tax due date, claiming the Gregorian reform robbed him of valuable planting time. And more recently, there's been a fringe case from the early 2000s where an individual in the US filed a handwritten lawsuit blaming the alignment of the Earth and Sun for his misfortunes, citing inaccuracies in the leap year system and daylight saving time. The case was, of course, dismissed, but it exists. It's in a record. Someone really tried to sue the passage of time, and somewhere in a dusty drawer of a district courthouse, that file still sits. So yes, technically someone tried to sue the Sun fringe, definitely, but it's part of our history now. The open scholarly debate in this realm, whether or not legal systems should even rely on solar-based calendars anymore. In our increasingly digital world, some legal scholars suggest switching to atomic time or binary calendar, logic systems built on repeatable, computable cycles rather than astronomical approximation. But critics warn this would detach us further from natural rhythms and cause mass confusion across religious and cultural practices. After all, if your holy day has always depended on a lunar calendar, what happens when a digital system tells you it no longer aligns? You lean back in the stiff wooden pew of the courtroom as more lawyers rise to argue over temporarily misplaced documentation. One barrister suggests that entire legislative schedules should be rewritten to accommodate real astronomical data. Another counters that tradition matters more than accuracy. They argue for consistency over precision. You glance down at your own hands, suddenly wondering what day it is. Not in the what's today, but in the what's the agreed upon consensus for when this moment exists. Where time, you realize, is a social contract, and you, sitting there, are in breach of it simply by being uncertain. The judge bangs a gavel, though it sounds more like a spoon against a teacup hand, calls for recess. You drift into the hallway, where a clock with 13 hours ticks just slightly off beat. Two men in powdered wigs are arguing whether today technically began at midnight or at sunrise. Another lawyer nearby is trying to get a fax machine to understand the Julian calendar, and that's when you spot the corkboard. Pinned notices listing trial dates requiring temporal clarification. There are dozens. One labeled Lost Time versus Local Parliament is scheduled for next Tuesday or maybe last Tuesday, depending on who you ask. Another simply reads Case. The missing hour of daylight saving. You don't want to know how long that one's been in appeals. But perhaps the most absurd entry of all is a flyer advertising a support group for those who were born between legal days. Apparently, one woman insists her birth was on February 3rd, a date that doesn't exist, and thus believes she should never age legally. A case is still pending. As you walk out into the warm light of the afternoon, or is it still morning, you realize how fragile our systems really are. All it takes is a misplaced leap day, a misprinted treaty, or a delayed feast day, and the scaffolding of orderly time begins to sway. And when it sways, so to do the laws, the emotions, and the deeply human rituals we've built around counting days. You sit on a courthouse bench, feeling the soft hum of a nearby clock that no longer ticks, and let the strangeness of it all cradle your thoughts. Time isn't just something you pass through, it's something we construct together, like a building fragile and elaborate. And once in a while someone tries to sue the architect. Sleep well. You've already survived a legal hearing about whether today is real. That's a win. When New Year's Day was in March, you blink again. Still curled on that courthouse bench, but now there's a smell of wet earth and flower pollen in the air. The door creaks open and a breeze rolls in, not cold, but the kind of mild chill that makes you want to wrap a blanket around your shoulders. You step outside and suddenly, it's spring. Birds are chirping. A parade of oddly dressed villagers marches by, some carrying banners that say Happy New Year. One man wears a crown made of parsley. Another is whacking a pot with a ladle and shouting in perfect cheer, Long live the 1st of March. You follow along, of course. Why wouldn't you? You've already survived temporal litigation and eaten a bun dedicated to imaginary time. But now you're in an era where calendars didn't just drift, they actually began on completely different days. This cheerful festival you've stumbled into is celebrating what used to be the start of the new year, March 25th. Yep, our mainstream historical fact is that in many European countries, particularly in England until 1752, the official new year began not on January 1st, but on March 25th, also known as Lady Day. For hundreds of years people filed taxes, marked births, and began legal contracts based on this springtime start. It was tied to agricultural rhythms and religious observances, and it made a kind of natural sense. Flowers blooming, birds nesting, fields being tilled. January 1st, in contrast, was just cold and bleak. Who starts anything new in a snowstorm? Not medieval clerks, that's for sure. But here's where things get quirky. with March as the starting line. Dates between January 1st and March 24th became a kind of liminal space, a gray zone. For example, a letter written on February 10, 1740 Old Style might be recorded by someone else as February 10, 1741 New Style. Historians and archivists now have to clarify dates from this period with duly notations like 1740 41st, just to be sure everyone's on the same page. It's an accounting nightmare and a dream for sleep historians. Now for our fringe. In fact, in some regions, people threw second New Year celebrations after the calendar switched just for nostalgia. They'd gather secretly or semi-officially and toast to the true New Year, refusing to acknowledge the January date imposed by reform. In Cornwall, for instance, scattered reports exist of late March bonfires being lit well into the 1800s, attended by villagers who insisted spring was still the rightful beginning. Some even believed starting the year in January brought bad luck, as it froze the blessings before they could take root. Imagine explaining that superstition at a corporate meeting. The scholarly debate this time is a surprisingly passionate one. What should actually count as the beginning of the year? Scholars of timekeeping, anthropology, and theology have argued that the choice of New Year's Day is more cultural than logical. Ancient Mesopotamians began their year after the first new moon following the vernal equinox. Romans tried several different months before settling on January. Some East Asian calendars still begin around February. Even today, cultures celebrate different starts from Rosh Hashanah to Nowruz to the Chinese Lunar New Year. So, is January 1st a universal truth? Not even close. It's just the version that became dominant because it served bureaucratic and imperial needs during the rise of centralized governments. You walk beside a small group of villagers now, listening, as they bicker over whether the cabbage harvest counts as a New Year act or simply a seasonal adjustment. One woman swears by the March date because that's when her grandmother always baked fresh start cakes. Another insists that she once started her taxes in January and her cows got sick. The conversation turns into a rhythmic chant, as they circle a maypole, yes, in March, and suddenly you find yourself humming along to a melody no one taught you. It's odd, yes, but it makes a kind of dream logic sense. You turn to see a large chalkboard perched at the town square's edge, with months written in a different order than you remember. March, April, May, and then all the way back to February. Below it, a smaller sign reads, "Don't trust time, trust the flowers." As the sun begins to dip behind crooked chimneys, you're handed a cup of warm cider and a pastry shaped like a lamb, symbol of rebirth. You sip, and your body softens. No one seems to care that the modern calendar abandoned this rhythm centuries ago. For these people, the old start still feels right. You watch a few children race around shouting, "Spring is king," and realize something else. Maybe it's not about getting the calendar right. Maybe it's about the sense of renewal, of choosing when to begin again. And for some, that's March. For others, it's a quiet Sunday in July, or the first night it rains after a long drought. You finish the cider, lie on the warm grass, and drift into a stillness that feels like it has no beginning, no end, just soft unfolding. Sleep well. The year may start whenever you decide. The typo that doomed an inheritance, you awaken not with a jolt, but with the gentle rustling of parchment and the creak of leather-bound ledgers. The world smells faintly of beeswax, dust, and old ink. You're seated now in the corner of a candlelit scribe's office where men with furrowed brows and aching wrists labor over scrolls with quills so long and delicate they tremble with every breath. On one desk lies an innocuous sheet of paper. One wrong letter, one misplaced numeral, and a family fortune is about to vanish forever. Welcome to the scene of a legal inheritance disaster caused entirely by a calendar typo. You wouldn't survive this place if you so much as sneezed near the inkpot. Tonight's mainstream historical fact is one of those strangely quiet tragedies. In early 18th century France, a land dispute over the precise date of death of a minor nobleman resulted in two rival families claiming the same estate, each with documents stamped by different clerks. One clerk used the new Gregorian calendar, while another, still clinging to the Julian, recorded the event as happening 10 days earlier. Those 10 days made all the difference. The legal proceedings dragged on for decades, and the land, intended to be passed to the nobleman's youngest daughter, was eventually seized by the crown, citing calendar ambiguity. The daughter, she ended up running a bread stall in Lyon. It's a classic case of a typo becoming a sentence. But now, on to the fringe fact. In colonial America, a bizarre misprint in a probate record once declared that a man had died February 30th, 1710, a date that doesn't exist in any calendar system. Yet, because of the rigid legal structures, At the time, the court refused to hear any amendments. The document stood, and his heirs couldn't claim the estate until it was proven that February 30th had never occurred. The irony, of course, is that no one could prove a negative to the court's satisfaction. For years, the family celebrated February 30th with silent dinners in protest. Eventually, the land was sold off by the state. To this day, local historians call it the ghost farm. And here's where we wade into open scholarly debate. Should legal systems allow for retrospective correction of clerical errors in foundational documents, such as birth, death, and property records? Some argue that strict literalism upholds the integrity of the legal process. Others contend that this rigidity only protects bureaucracy, not truth. In France, the debate sparked a brief academic movement in the 19th century advocating for a historical margin of error in all estate law. Nothing came of it except, naturally, a few misdated meeting minutes that caused two conferences to be scheduled on the same day a year apart. Back in the scribe's office, the quill trembles again. You lean in closer and watch as a clerk hesitates, his hand paused mid-air, as he debates whether to write June 4th or June 14th. Outside, the sun has already set, and neither date will match the true time of death. You feel the tension thicken, a silent war of ink and paper. He finally writes June 4th, and just like that, another century of legal confusion is born. You wander deeper into the building now, where dusty boxes are stacked like crypts. One is labeled inheritance cases still pending 16891705. Another reads disputes involving forgotten leap days. You crack open one and find a velvet pouch with 2 rings inside, along with a note that reads, "If this is discovered in a year that begins on a Tuesday, return to the Lanier family, otherwise destroy." Time-based inheritance conditions were not uncommon among the superstitious elite. Some nobles even inserted calendar riddles into their wills, demanding that heirs wait for the 3rd full moon following a blackbird's song. One such case took nearly 80 years to fulfill. When the heir finally arrived, he was 94, and just wanted a chair to sit on. These stories aren't just quaint, they shaped real property boundaries, city maps, and local power. In parts of Wales, a single typo in a monastery deed from 1603 shifted an entire village line south by nearly a mile. The local pub, which should have belonged to the crown, has been family-owned ever since thanks to that misplaced curve on a handwritten 3. You step into the next room and find a large hourglass lying shattered on the floor. Next to it, an inkwell, empty. Someone had tried to correct a date, perhaps with urgency, and spilled everything. A note reads, "The 12th or the 21st, who can tell?" You sigh, so much drama over dates. But as you sit down on a cold stone bench, it hits you: calendars aren't just pages. They're architecture. They support lives, fortunes, marriages, births, and deaths. And if you change one brick, the whole house trembles. So the next time someone complains about their calendar app syncing incorrectly, remind them that somewhere, someone once lost a castle because a monk got distracted while copying the date, and someone else, well, they just kept celebrating February 30th. You close your eyes and let the scent of ink and old wax lull you into stillness. You've wandered through a scribe's worst nightmare and lived to yawn about it. Sleep well, and maybe double-check the date on your birth certificate. The emperor who ignored the calendar. You stir slightly, just enough to notice that your seat has turned into a velvet-lined bench in what smells like a royal audience chamber. Outside, bells toll not to mark the hour, but for reasons no one seems sure about. A servant in silken slippers walks past, muttering that the emperor is refusing again. Refusing what? You wonder. You follow, and find yourself inside an ornate palace lit with lanterns that flicker strangely. Calendars hang on the walls, dozens of them, each showing a different year. Welcome to the court of an emperor who decided that calendars were beneath him. In fact, he declared time to be irrelevant to greatness. Tonight's mainstream historical fact introduces you to Yongzheng, the 18th century Qing dynasty emperor, who, for a brief but fascinating window, refused to officially acknowledge the Western Gregorian calendar, even though it had already been introduced to the imperial court by Jesuit missionaries. While he didn't erase traditional Chinese lunar calendars, Yongzheng detested foreign influence and delayed all official switchovers, even in diplomatic documents. His stance wasn't just national pride, it was power control. If time itself could be dictated, what else could be? The court became a theater of silence, where documents arrived late or early depending on which calendar they followed. Diplomats were often forced to submit 2 versions of the same letter, one for Confucian scholars, one for international courts, and if you got the date wrong, you might be exiled to the provinces or worse, told to work in the Bureau of Corrections, which was a real and terrifying thing. But let's move to our fringe fact. In this same court, a eunuch named Dayun once caused a scandal by throwing a birthday banquet for the emperor on the wrong day twice. He claimed the stars had shifted and that the true heavenly date was hidden from common calendars. The emperor was amused, but also annoyed. Dayun was reassigned to supervise irrigation reports for the next decade. Meanwhile, the emperor's birthday was quietly marked on 3 different dates every year thereafter, just in case. Now for the scholarly debate. How much did calendar control influence the emperor's grip on power? Some historians argue that, by refusing to standardize time with the West, Yongjing was making a profound statement about sovereignty. Others believe it was simply administrative chaos and superstition disguised as statecraft. Chinese bureaucrats spent centuries reconciling the lunar system with solar realities, resulting in some of the most sophisticated hybrid calendars in history, but also some of the most contradictory even today. Scholars dispute the accuracy of Qingera records because dates were retroactively corrected by court astrologers to match what they believed the cosmos meant, not what had actually occurred. You're offered a scroll now. A young palace scribe holds it out reverently, saying, "This records the emperor's dream from last night." The date is approximate. You unroll it and find descriptions of flying tortoises and a dinner with a man made of stars. At the bottom is written, "Transcribed on the 29th day of the 17th moon of the year of the whispering tiger," or possibly the laughing ox. You nod solemnly. Of course, makes perfect sense. You wander down a hallway lined with sundials that point in every direction but up. A plaque nearby reads, "Time is a suggestion, not a command." You smile, because you're starting to agree. As strange as this world is, there's a kind of logic to it. If rulers control the calendar, they control the narrative. You think about modern examples, how fiscal years, election cycles, and product launches all hinge on arbitrary cutoffs. Isn't that a kind of soft power? A way of making time work for you, not against you. In this palace, you realize, clocks don't tick. Time is written, massaged, reinterpreted. You step into another chamber and find a clockmaker hammering numbers into a copper dial. This one, he tells you, runs backward, so people remember where they came from. You look, the hands spin in reverse. You stare for a while, and it feels strangely right. Outside, the sun is rising or setting, it's hard to say. But either way, the emperor hasn't checked his calendar in weeks. He doesn't have to. The empire will wait. So you sit, gently reclining on a silk cushion embroidered with dragons and plum blossoms, and let the absence of time lull you into a deeper rest. You might wake up tomorrow, or yesterday, but for now, none of that matters. The farmer who sued the equinoxier no longer in the emperor's palace. Instead, you now find yourself standing ankle-deep in a patch of freshly tilled earth. A soft breeze tugs at your sleeves, and the scent of manure, damp grass, and rye fills the air. Chickens scuttle past you with alarming indifference, and in the distance an ox trudges lazily across a furrowed field. Everything seems calm until a man in a patched tunic barrels past, waving a crumpled piece of parchment and shouting, "This harvest was cursed by the calendar." You, of course, follow him, because who wouldn't want to know how someone blames a date for bad wheat? You soon arrive at a thatched roof farmhouse where a local court is in session, chickens and all. This, you discover, is the scene of a trial, one of history's most peculiar and perhaps pettiest legal complaints. Tonight's mainstream historical fact begins in 1583. Not long after Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar reform to fix inaccuracies in the Julian calendar. The change involved dropping 10 days from the calendar to realign the equinox with its proper place in the solar year. The new system helped keep Easter and spring, which was deeply important to the church. But to farmers who relied on centuries of tradition to know when to plant and harvest, this sudden change was chaos. In England, one such farmer named Long, lost to history but referred to in court records simply as Hugh the Younger, brought a formal complaint to the local bailiff, claiming that the new calendar had stolen his barley crop. He had planted on the date passed down by his father and grandfather, but thanks to the reform, spring arrived 10 days earlier than expected. His entire field, he said, had died of confusion. Hugh sued the village astrologer for misled him about the equinox, and the astrologer, in turn, sued the local priest for agreeing to the Pope's calendar. The priest responded by excommunicating the astrologer. It was a mess, and that leads us to our fringe fact. In a neighboring village, a group of farmers refused to acknowledge the calendar change at all. Instead, they created their own version of the year, inserting fallow weeks as compensation for the days they lost. They celebrated what they called the Festival of the Returned Days, where neighbors would swap gifts, eat salted herring, and plant symbolic seeds in pots they never intended to water. This curious observance continued for over 50 years before finally being banned by an annoyed bishop who claimed it confused the Lord's timetable. And now for the scholarly debate, were these early reactions to the Gregorian reform a genuine expression of rural resistance to ecclesiastical authority or simply the result of widespread calendar illiteracy? Historians are divided. Some argue that peasants and farmers understood time through natural signs, the flowering of trees, the behavior of animals, not official dates. For them, time was observed, not calculated. Others believe the backlash reveals an early form of social protest, a refusal to let elites dictate the rhythms of daily life. After all, what is power if not the ability to name when spring begins? You settle into a hay bale in the back of the makeshift courtroom. A rooster jumps up beside you, seemingly eager to hear the proceedings. The judge, who doubles as the village butcher, bangs a ladle against a chopping block and declares, "Let it be known that barley follows the moon, not the Pope." The room cheers. You look around and realize the trial isn't about justice at all. It's about certainty. These people want to believe that if they plant their seeds on the same date every year, they'll be rewarded. But now, the sun says otherwise. The sky has shifted. The earth has changed its tune, and the numbers no longer match the wind. You walk outside as the trial continues, stepping past carts filled with apples, crates of radishes, and a single pig wearing a red ribbon. Farmers gather in small groups, muttering about lost days and crooked stars. One man swears that since the change, his sheep give birth a week early. Another says his wife hasn't smiled since they moved Easter. The anxiety is palpable, and yet, in the middle of it all, a child runs through the field chasing butterflies, entirely indifferent to calendars or complaints. You follow her gaze up to the sky. The clouds drift slowly, and the sun glows steadily overhead, neither aware nor concerned about the number written on parchment. Time, it seems, goes on. Eventually, you find yourself back inside the farmhouse, where Hugh the Younger is now appealing to the bishop, offering him a bundle of dried herbs and asking for a retrial. The bishop sighs, mutters something about divine scheduling, and walks out. The rooster crows again, and someone yells, "Well, we'll plant when the bees start buzzing." Then, a laugh ripples through the room. Tradition reasserts itself, but with a wink, and as you rest your head against a beam, your eyelids growing heavier, you marvel at how a typo, in this case a deliberate change, can ripple through the simplest parts of life. From emperors to farmers, no one escapes the grasp of the calendar. You drift deeper now, not counting days or months, but listening to the timeless hum of bees, wind, and earth. The world spins whether or not we approve its speed. The parliament that forgot what day it was, as the sun dips lazily behind a bank of clouds, somehow always the right amount of overcast. In this version of the past, you find yourself climbing a creaky staircase lined with candle sconces that haven't been lit in years. Dust floats like slow-moving ghosts through the air, and the scent of ink, old wool, and stale biscuits clings to the walls. A brass plate on the door reads, "Parliamentary session in progress, possibly." You crack the door open. Inside, a cluster of red-faced gentlemen in powdered wigs are engaged in a heated argument about ... nothing, and everything. You've stepped into an 18th century parliamentary chamber, one that has completely lost track of what day it is. Thanks to the calendar reform. Welcome to tonight's chaos, the mainstream historical fact that leads us in. In 1752, Great Britain officially adopted the Gregorian calendar to catch up with the rest of Catholic Europe, who had made the switch more than 150 years earlier. The British had to correct an accumulated error by skipping 11 days. Wednesday, September 2nd was immediately followed by Thursday, September 14th. This administrative decision, though scientifically sound, caused political mayhem. Meetings were missed, legal filings went awry, even scheduled executions were postponed, which, frankly, may have caused some mixed feelings. The public panicked, but Parliament didn't handle it much better. In one recorded session, a vote was delayed for over a week because members couldn't agree on whether it was already the next week. Calendars across counties were out of sync, and ministers arriving from rural districts sometimes showed up 10 days late or 11 days early. As you perch on the wooden gallery steps watching this fictionalized but emotionally accurate scene unfold, you see a gentleman waving a crumpled almanac shouting, "It is not Thursday, it's the ghost of Monday." Others groan in agreement, or confusion. Your favorite detail is the clerk taking minutes in both old and new styles, just in case. Now here's your fringe fact for the evening. One particularly flustered MP from Dorset insisted on inventing a personal timekeeping system called the gentleman's reckoning. According to his diaries, he divided the day into 17 unequal moods instead of hours. He insisted that votes should only be cast during the Stoic crescent, roughly what we might call mid-afternoon, but his definition shifted depending on whether the sun had appeared. He even wore 2 watches, neither of which was set to anything resembling actual time. Scholars still argue whether he was ahead of his era or just eccentric beyond repair. Which brings us to the scholarly debate. Was the "Give Us Back Our 11 Days" slogan a real public protest or a satirical fabrication? For centuries, it was accepted that angry mobs rioted in the streets demanding the return of their stolen time. Some accounts describe candlelit marches, effigies of timekeepers being burned, and petitions signed in alehouses. However, modern historians have cast doubt on whether these riots ever occurred. Many believe the famous phrase was a political cartoon's invention, meant to mock the government's bumbling rather than reflect true unrest. There's even evidence that the phrase didn't appear until years after the reform, used as a punchline in theatrical pamphlets rather than court transcripts. But you're sitting here now, in this make-believe chamber where at least one MP keeps muttering, "If we cannot trust the days, what is the point of the hours?" He collapses dramatically into a velvet chair, spilling a small cup of tea onto a docket labeled "Urgent, Determined Date." You lean against a fluted column and imagine what it must have felt like, this subtle disorientation, this creeping sense that the reliable ticking of time could be rewritten on a whim. For farmers, it meant ruined harvests. For ministers, it meant delayed decisions. For lovers, missed rendezvous, perhaps even anniversaries, celebrated on dates that no longer technically existed. You glance at a wall clock. It's stopped, probably a metaphor. Somewhere behind you, a voice begins reading legislation aloud, in a tone so slow and dry it could replace sandpaper. Be it resolved under the measure of conditional daylight, that no meeting henceforth shall commence during periods of calendrical ambiguity. You've never agreed with emotion more. As the drone continues, you're lulled deeper into the plush folds of historical confusion. Your thoughts drift. If a government can shift the calendar so freely, what else can they bend? Could they move years, erase whole months, declare birthdays retroactive? You chuckle softly. Somewhere out there, a poor scribe is still trying to reconcile a contract written on September 10th, a date that never officially happened. As the parliamentary chamber continues its spirited debate about which Thursday is actually Thursday, you stretch out on a bench padded with forgotten tax forms and close your eyes. A dusty breeze brushes your cheek, and the ticking silence returns, timeless and content. In this world of lost days and found debates, sleep arrives exactly when it's ready, not a moment sooner, not a second too late. When birthdays vanished from official records, you shuffle quietly through the crumbling hallway of a medieval town registry office, the scent of moldy parchment and beeswax sealing wax wafting through the air. Your shoes tap on uneven stone as you step past long-forgotten filing cabinets brimming with yellowed scrolls tied in red ribbon. You pause at one labeled births 1700 to 1755. And something strange immediately stands out. An entire stretch of birthdays seems to have disappeared. Names are scratched out, dates mismatched. A whole generation of babies seems to have been born on non-existent days, and no one quite knows what to do with them. Welcome to the aftermath of a calendar reform that stole not just sleep, but birthdays. This section's mainstream historical fact. When Britain adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752, the change meant skipping 11 days in September. September 2nd was followed by September 14th. That meant anyone whose birthday fell between September 3rd and September 13th suddenly found their special day ... erased. No parties, no cakes. Well, they didn't really do cakes. But still no oat porridge celebrations, and no recognition in legal records. In fact, official documents such as birth certificates, court appointments, and marriage licenses had to be rewritten or postdated, causing legal chaos that lingered for decades. Imagine explaining in court that you weren't technically born anymore. Now for your fringe or quirky fact. In one documented case in Yorkshire, a local baker named Mabel Flockhart refused to let the change ruin her son's birthday. She held this party on September 14th every year, claiming it's a thought that counts Sivan if the Pope stole the rest. In her village, it became tradition to call those with vanished birthdays the lost ones. Every year on September 13th, villagers would place a single candle on their windowsill in silent tribute to anyone who had been calendarically robbed. One year they accidentally set the parson's curtains on fire, but the sentiment was sweet. And here's tonight's scholarly debate. Did the concept of a fixed birth date even matter much to ordinary people in the 18th century? Some historians argue that for most folks, particularly rural laborers, small tradesmen, and women, birthdays weren't really celebrated or even remembered precisely. You were born during harvest or a few days after St. Swithin's Day, and that was good enough. Official records were for taxes and wills, not cakes and candles. Others disagree, pointing to growing record-keeping practices, the increasing importance of age and legal contracts, and parish baptism dates being tied closely to one's identity. The erasure of 11 days wasn't just a bureaucratic hit, it disrupted how people marked the passage of life itself. You find a stack of old letters on a nearby desk, all dated September 10, 1752. One has a note scribbled in the margin. Does this day count? Should we wait? It's oddly poignant, people struggling to fit life's milestones into a system that no longer recognizes them. One particularly tragic letter reads, "Our daughter was to be wed today, but the calendar swallowed it. We danced anyway." You can almost hear the mournful fiddle in the distance playing for a wedding that technically never happened. The woman they called Mabel the baker appears again in the margins of several letters, her neat handwriting correcting dates, rewriting recipes for oat biscuits, and once noting in frustration, if God had meant to steal days, he wouldn't have made roosters crow at the same time each morning. You love her instantly, a woman who knows that the sun rises no matter what a calendar says. You wander through the office and find a makeshift birthday ledger labeled New Style. Inside are dozens of recalculated birth dates, but the notes get sloppier with each entry. Moved forward by 11 days. Approximate guess swears it snowed. Born on missing days celebrates in October now. There's a quiet sorrow to it. You realize people didn't just lose days, they lost stories. Whole childhoods became slightly off kilter. Generations grew up confused about their age, unsure if they were older or younger than their friends. In some towns, the confusion was so widespread that local councils created honorary birthdays so that no one would feel left out. One pub even declared September 13th everyone's day, offering free ale to anyone who could prove their birth date no longer existed. Naturally, the place ran dry by sunset. You step out of the registry office, the evening air crisp and sweet with chimney smoke. The street outside is quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the creak of a wagon wheel. In a candlelit window, you see a family gathered around a no doubt a birthday treat for someone who technically was never born, according to the calendar. But their laughter rings clear. The world, it seems, has decided that dates are suggestions. Celebrations don't need permission from the Pope or Parliament. They only need warmth, memory, and good food. You wrap your coat tighter, heart warmed by the resilience of people who celebrate it anyway. And as you walk slowly past flickering window panes and stories left untold, you realize that even lost days can still carry meaning, especially when remembered out loud, in quiet, loving voices. The merchant's ledger that refused to balance the narrow alley you now walk through feels strangely alive, even though it's quiet. The cobblestones beneath your feet are worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, and the flickering lanterns overhead paint everything in a soft golden hue. You catch a whiff of boiled ink and beeswax as you reach the low wooden doorway of a counting house's small but tidy two-story office belonging to a merchant who, you're told, had a mental breakdown over days, specifically days that no longer existed. You step inside and the air shifts. The room is packed with ledgers, scrolls, and neat rows of abacuses. A single quill is still perched on the edge of a blotched ledger, as though someone just stood up in frustration and never returned. And here is our grounded historical fact. After the 1752 calendar reform in Britain, bookkeeping and accounting across the country descended into absolute disarray. Banks, merchants, and anyone dealing in credit or trade had to adjust all their records to accommodate for the sudden 11-day jump. But this wasn't as simple as scratching out a line and adding a footnote. Payments due, interest accrued, rent, loans, all of it hinged on specific dates. A debt expected on September 10th. Well, that date just didn't exist anymore. So, was the debtor late, or early, or what? Ledgers failed to match up, receipts conflicted, people argued, and in some cases, entire financial contracts had to be renegotiated because of the phantom days. It wasn't just confusion, it was financial instability masquerading as a clerical adjustment. Now let's turn to tonight's quirky fact. One silk merchant in Bristol, Mr. Thomas Hobbins, insisted that he'd solve the issue elegantly by inventing his own personal calendar. He added a week called the Nowhere Days between August and September, in which no interest could be calculated, no payments accepted, and no debts collected. For that week, His shop closed, his books froze, and he claimed to be in a state of philosophical accounting meditation. His wife, less amused, referred to this annually as Tom's vanishing week and used it to visit her sister in Bath remarkably. Some of his customers respected this ritual, and it became an odd local tradition for nearby vendors to hang signs saying "Gone to Nowhere" during the second week of September. It became part financial policy, part local folklore. Now for the scholarly debate that's still a thorny topic. Did the calendar reform lead to long-term distrust in record-keeping institutions, or was the chaos short-lived? Some historians argue that these 11 missing days exposed how fragile bureaucratic trust really was, that people saw firsthand how easily the very systems they relied on for financial and legal order could be overwritten by a royal decree. The unease lingered, they say, contributing to growing skepticism about centralized control over time, trade, and governance. Others suggest the chaos, while dramatic, was temporary. They point out that most record keepers adjusted within a year or two, and some even saw this as an opportunity to reform overly complex or inconsistent systems. In short, it wasn't the missing days that were the problem, but the underlying mess they revealed. Back in the counting house, you find yourself drawn to the merchant's desk. A heavy ledger sits open to a page titled September Transactions Adjust. The entries are frantic. Some are dated. One reads, "Payment received on the 9th, or was it the 20th?" Another says, "Client insists this date did not exist. Partial refund issued." The frustration bleeds through the ink. There's even a doodle of a man tearing a calendar in half with the note, "Me." You pull open a drawer and discover a neat stack of unsigned IOUs, each dated September 10th, 1752. As though people thought that by writing their debts on a non-existent day, they wouldn't have to pay them. Clever. Wrong, but clever. A thin journal at the bottom of the drawer catches your eye. Inside, the merchant describes waking up each morning unsure whether the day was real. He began leaving breadcrumbs by the door to prove to himself that time had passed. He even recorded the position of shadows across the windowsill at noon to chart the sun's progression. A line stands out. "If time is a man-made illusion, then I am either very rich or very confused." You imagine him walking through his shop, watching candles burn down, weighing silk and silver, and never fully trusting whether today was today. A man trapped not by numbers, but by time's betrayal. As you leave the office, you notice something scratched into the wall beside the door, nearly faded. "Herein lies 11 days, too shy to show their faces." It's poetic. You linger outside, listening to the distant hum of a street violinist playing something sweet and slow. You think about all the people like this merchant who depended on time not just for routine but for survival. Time was money. But when time vanished, it wasn't just numbers that fell apart, it was trust, and yet, somehow they carried on, adjusted, adapted, even invented strange personal rituals like the nowhere days. You smile, warmed by the odd resilience of it all. The merchant may have hated his ledgers, but he never stopped writing. And maybe, just maybe, that's how you get through the loss of something so abstract as time. You write your way around it. You invent a corner of your world where the missing days still live. Somewhere in that quiet alley, a candle flickers in a windowsill, marking a date that no longer exists but is remembered anyway. The farmer who missed his own harvest festival. You wander away from the merchant's lane into the outskirts of a village, where the smell of earth and damp hay welcomes you like an old wool blanket. The cottages here are simple wattle and daub, walls, thatched roofs, smoke curling from low chimneys. Chickens murmur softly from a nearby coop, and the rhythmic clunk of a water wheel spins a gentle lullaby into the evening air. A soft fog is rolling over the fields. You follow it and find yourself at the edge of a plot of farmland, where a scarecrow leans sideways like it, too, is tired of arguing with calendars. Here begins the tale of a man named Jory Tanner. No court records, no famous letters, just local lore that somehow clings to the soil like mud on boots. Jory was a farmer who prided himself on never needing a clock, let alone a calendar. He planted when the sparrows nested, harvested when the apples soured, and celebrated his harvest, the festival when the evenings turned orange. But when the calendar changed in 1752 and 11 days vanished, poor Jory did not realize that his annual wheat and whiskey day had already passed. When he wandered into the village square with sacks of grain and a fiddle tucked under his arm, he found no lanterns, no music, no stalls of boiled sweets, just silence. That year Jory missed the harvest. No feast, no dancing, no joy. And this is our mainstream historical fact. Many rural communities operated on cyclical, nature-based calendars, more than printed ones. For them, seasonal festivals, like harvests or equinox feasts, were not pinned to numbered days, but to signs from the land. Yet the adoption of the Gregorian calendar by the British Empire overrode these rhythms, replacing lived experience with printed uniformity. The problem: weather doesn't care about paper. For many farmers, this sudden shift threw off planting schedules, disrupted festivals, and forced local customs into disarray. Some villagers refused to acknowledge the change altogether, holding festivals when the moon said so, no matter what date London declared it was. That year, Jory Tanner became something of a legend. The villagers, amused and sympathetic, declared a second harvest feast a week later called Jory's Day. It was smaller, clumsier, and mostly fueled by leftover mead, but it was the sort of rural rebellion that sticks. And here's your quirky fact. In Devonshire, records suggest that villagers continued to host two separate harvest feasts for decades after 1752, one on the new calendar date and one on the true festival, often using Jory's name as an inside joke. In some corners of England, this practice persisted well into the 19th century. Imagined Thanksgivings, and no one complaining. As for our scholarly debate tonight, did the Gregorian calendar reform signal a move towards centralized control, at the expense of folk tradition? Some historians argue that the enforcement of the new calendar represented the imposition of elite order over rural autonomy, a way for urban clerks and government officials to standardize time in a way that undermined local knowledge. By dictating when a year begins or when taxes are due, the crown quietly seized one of the most ancient powers of a community, the power to decide what day it is. Others contend the change was largely pragmatic, and that the loss of a few days was a small price to pay for astronomical accuracy. After all, the old Julian calendar had been drifting out of sync with the solar year for centuries. Without reform, spring festivals would eventually end up in winter. And so, they argue, some local adjustment was inevitable. But perhaps both are true. Progress does often cost something intangible. Jory Tanner might have agreed, though he probably would have just asked when the apples were sour again. You stroll past the edge of the field, where a small wooden sign once read Jory's Field. It's mostly overgrown now. Nearby, a rusted horseshoe dangles from a nail hammered into an apple tree. Someone still remembers. You sit by the tree, watching the mist thicken over the stalks of barley swaying. In the dark, somewhere, faint laughter, echoes imagined or real, who knows? Maybe it's Jory fiddling into the night, harvest or no harvest. His was a festival that no calendar could kill. The fields always know what time it is. You lie back in the grass, the smell of loam and old cider rising up around you. The stars overhead seem a little off-kilter, as if they're still trying to remember which night was stolen. Somewhere a barn owl hoots. You think of all the people like Jory tethered not to clocks but to wind and wheat, and you wonder if maybe we got it backwards. Maybe it was never about knowing the date. Maybe the secret was always just knowing when the apples were ripe. The confused courtroom where time took the stand the path before you narrows into a corridor of grey stone, its edges softened by age and moss. The torch sconces on the wall flicker as you approach a heavy wooden door with iron bands and a latch that creaks like a reprimanding schoolmaster. You push it open and step into a small courtroom, dusty benches, cracked leather cushions, and a judge's bench that leans slightly to the left, as though it's weary of the proceedings. A shaft of moonlight sneaks in through a circular window. High above, illuminating a solitary figure carved into the wood, the scales of justice held by a woman who seems to be looking over her shoulder. It's fitting, really. Tonight, we examine what happened when the British court system had to answer a seemingly absurd but legally valid question. If a date is erased from the calendar, can it still be held responsible? This is our grounded historical fact. After the calendar change of 1752, British courts were suddenly flooded with legal petitions and disputes over dates that no longer existed. One of the most persistent legal headaches came from leases, wills, and contracts that were all dated within the missing 11 days from September 3rd to 13th. Tenants asked if rent was still due on the 10th, even though the 10th was now gone. Plaintiffs questioned if crimes committed on or about the 5th of September were even legally classifiable anymore. And one particularly confused magistrate reportedly asked whether an alibi could still apply if the day in question had evaporated. Which brings us to the courtroom. You now stand in an amalgam of many such spaces across England, but inspired particularly by records from the Lincolnshire Assizes, where a judge famously postponed an entire case because he refused to convict on a date that God himself had struck from the heavens. It's hard not to chuckle at that. But the fringe reality is stranger still. In some lesser courts, clever defendants began exploiting the chaos by challenging the very structure of time. One man in Nottinghamshire claimed his 7-year sentence should be shortened by 11 days in the interest of fairness. Another argued that a deadline for paying a debt had already passed, since time itself had leapfrogged it. One landlord tried to evict a tenant early, claiming those 11 days counted as default. You get the sense that, for a while, legal proceedings resembled a Monty Python sketch more than a solemn affair. But make no mistake, this chaos had real consequences. Contracts collapsed, inheritances were challenged, and the entire legal calendar had to be rebuilt. Which brings us to the scholarly debate that still lingers. Did the calendar change force British law to evolve into a more flexible, human-centered institution, or did it expose how arbitrarily it was tethered to systems that could be rewritten overnight? Some legal historians argue that the event marked a rare moment when law had to reckon with metaphysics. What is a day, after all, if not a shared hallucination made official by ink? And if we can erase 11 of them, what else can be undone? Others say this is overblown, that courts simply did what they've always done, interpret rules through precedent and public expectation. In this view, the chaos forced greater legal literacy, especially among the common folk, many of whom had never before questioned how time could affect justice. The courtroom you're standing in seems to sigh under the weight of it all. Papers are strewn across a long oak table, stained with rings from pewter mugs. A docket lists absurd trial names, the case of the vanishing debt, petition for postponement of crime, cattle theft on an allegedly non-existent day. You spot a clerk's scribbled note, ask Parliament for rules on days that no longer exist urgently. It's both hilarious and tragic. You imagine being a poor farmer summoned to court, bewildered and probably angry, standing before a judge who himself isn't sure what year it is. Some courtrooms apparently solved the problem with brute logic. If the event couldn't be dated, it didn't happen. Others allowed for deemed dates, adding a legal fiction to stand in for the missing time. But these weren't just scribbles in a ledger, they affected lives. A woman might lose her inheritance because her uncle's will was dated September 7. A merchant might be fined for failing to appear on a day that technically never dawned. And so, law twisted itself into loops, trying to chase the tail of time. You take a seat in one of the old benches and run your fingers along the grooved wood. The names of the accused are carved there, mostly forgotten now. You wonder how many of them were innocent, guilty, or simply confused. Perhaps some were all three. The flicker of torchlight catches on a framed parchment that reads, "In matters of time, the court shall observe common sense." Below it, someone's added in ink on alternate Tuesdays, weather permitting. A joke, probably, but also, maybe not. The air feels heavy, like the courtroom itself is still unsure whether it exists. You hear the rustle of imaginary robes, the shuffle of ghostly boots. Someone clears their throat in memory. Somewhere, deep in the archives, the minutes of a trial begin with, "On the day known to none." And you realize that sometimes, the law must bend not to morality, but to madness. You stand and exit quietly, the door closing with a soft thud behind you. Outside the night is still and the stars offer no legal opinion. Just their usual light, unburdened by clocks. The lost wedding that wasn't legally married. You now follow a lantern-lit path through the village square, passing shuttered inns and a silent bell tower whose hands refuse to point anywhere useful. The night hums with invisible crickets, and somewhere a dog barks once and then thinks better of it. You find yourself before a modest stone chapel, nothing extravagant, but tidy in a way that says someone once loved it dearly. Its little wooden doors open with a groan, and you step into a hush so complete, your breath feels loud. Rows of pews wait like old men lined up at a town meeting, and a simple altar stands adorned with dried herbs and a faded tapestry of Saint Swithin, patron of bad weather and worse luck. Tonight you've entered the curious case of Thomas and Mary, a couple whose love story was perfectly normal until the calendar swallowed their wedding date. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1752, when the British Empire shifted from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, September 3rd through 13th were removed entirely. No ceremonies could legally occur on those days because, on paper, they didn't exist. But this change wasn't well communicated across the kingdom, especially in small towns or among the illiterate population. Many families and clergy either weren't told, didn't care, or simply didn't understand what was happening. And that's where Thomas and Mary come in. They were supposed to be married on September 10th, 1752, in this very chapel. The banns had been read, the flowers arranged, the chickens fattened for soup, and so, when the day arrived, or rather didn't, they stood at the altar anyway. The priest, Reverend Claymore, was an elderly man with eyesight like milk and a memory full of rain. He performed the ceremony as planned, probably muttering something about the devil stealing days again. The couple kissed, signed their names, and began their lives together. Only later did the village scribe, more curious than usual, send the documents to the county registry, where they were returned with a red stamp. No such date exists. Marriage not legally recognized. Cue the confusion. Our quirky historical detail this actually happened in various forms across Britain. There are parish records with marriages crossed out, redacted, or bizarrely annotated with phrases like event conducted in spirit or ceremony performed outside of lawful time. One couple in Norfolk even held a second wedding just to be safe, though they insisted the first one felt more romantic. Thomas and Mary, however, refused to remarry. They insisted their love was twice as true to survive a date that never happened. Their union became the stuff of local legend. The town's children grew up believing they were born of ghost weddings and that their parents were married in a pocket of time that God had misplaced. Legally, though, it caused all kinds of problems. Property deeds, inheritance rights, and even child legitimacy came into question. Some argued in court that a couple wed during the lost days had no legal claim to joint assets. Others asked if the children of such unions were technically born out of wedlock, even if the ceremony had happened. The scholarly debate lingers. Were the missing days a harmless bureaucratic hiccup or a deep insult to the rituals that held communities together? Some historians argue that marriage, as both a religious and legal institution, should transcend the arbitrary measures of a calendar. To them, love and vows aren't beholden to date stamps. Others contend that such flexibility erodes the trust in systems meant to protect citizens. If a marriage date can disappear, what else can be undone? Could a royal pardon vanish too, or a debt, or a birthright? In this way, the vanishing days became not just a footnote but a test case for the boundaries of law, faith, and memory. You wander toward the altar where Thomas and Mary were wed, perhaps twice or maybe only once, depending on whom you ask. The air is still heavy with the scent of old incense and dried rosemary. You notice a page of parchment behind the pulpit, framed and yellowed, their original marriage certificate, dated September 10th, 1752, with a tiny note in the margin, witnessed with love, if not with law. You smile. It's a better vow than most. As you exit the chapel, a breeze stirs the ivy clinging to its stones. Somewhere far away, a bell rings midnight. Or maybe it's ringing nothing at all. After all, who's to say what time it is when time itself once forgot to show up? You think of Thomas and Mary walking back down the aisle, hand in hand, into a future the law didn't quite recognize but the village did. And maybe that was enough. A rooster crows somewhere, confused, as you make your way back toward the sleeping streets. The ground feels solid again, but in your pocket of memory, you tuck away a date that never wasn't two hearts who didn't need the calendar's permission. The 11-day paycheck that never came as the cobbled path leads you down toward the edge of town. You come upon a modest blacksmith's shop, one of those unassuming places where everything looks like it's been hit with a hammer, because, well, it has. You peer inside through the cracked window and spot a bench and anvil, and a wall of tools lined with the obsessive symmetry only a craftsman would care about. And then you notice the ledger. It sits open on a counter, yellowed, with soot and grease-smudged fingers. Its ink faded but still legible. It's a payroll record from September 1752, neatly marked with the names of workers, their wages, and rather conspicuously no entries for September 3rd through the 13th. Welcome to the most irritating practical side effect of losing 11 days. Nobody got paid for them. Yes, this is your mainstream historical fact tonight. When Britain adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752 and skipped 11 days, most workers on daily or weekly wages lost pay for days that, officially, never that existed. Employers, following the law, simply didn't pay for them. After all, the days were absent from the books, but the people still lived them. They still fed their children, lit candles at night, and showed up to work expecting the world to behave like it did the day before, which of course it didn't. That's where things get tense. Imagine being a dock worker in Bristol, hauling crates for a shipping company that tells you, "Sorry mate, calendars jumped ahead, guess your hands didn't work on the 5th. Or a seamstress in Bath, sewing for long hours under candlelight, only to be told you weren't paid for those days because, technically, you didn't exist. One of the more fringe-wide bits of history here. In some towns, Workers actually went on strike not over working conditions, but over metaphysics. One famous example is the Manchester Mill protest, where workers demanded 11 imaginary shillings for the 11 imaginary days they lost. The factory owners, bemused and dismissive, offered instead a half-day's extra tea break in October. It did not go over well, and so we drift into the scholarly debate. Did this calendar reform highlight the fundamental injustice of wage labor, exposing how time and the control of it served the employer, not the worker? Historians are split. Some argue that this was an early glimpse into labor consciousness, when working people began to understand how arbitrary power structures like clocks and calendars could be manipulated against them. Others see it as a brief, chaotic episode that passed quickly, with little lasting change. Either way, it reveals something often forgotten. That time, especially in the 18th century, was a tool of those who measured it. You glance back at the ledger again. Its blank dates like little voids on the page. The blacksmith, probably someone with arms like tree trunks and a temper to match, had no doubt clocked in every day. But those days are now legal ghosts, hazy, unrecorded, unpaid. Imagine going to the local magistrate to argue your case. "Sir, I swear I worked those days." And the magistrate replies, "What days?" You wonder how many people simply gave up, swallowed the loss, and moved on. Or how many stewed with quiet resentment. Perhaps some even kept their own secret calendars, noting the days that it happened regardless of what Parliament declared. Just outside the smithy, you find a broken clock nailed to a post. Its hands are jammed at 3:11. Coincidence, perhaps, but it makes you think. What if someone froze that clock on purpose to remember a time that was removed from memory? What if others had done the same, each choosing a moment from those lost days to mark as their own? A personal protest against the erasure of time. The more you walk through this world, the more you realize that history isn't just wars and kings, it's also missed paychecks, broken contracts, and the quiet injustice of people being told they were invisible. You turn the corner and spot a small tavern with a sign that reads "The Missing Days." A joke, maybe, or a statement. Inside you hear low murmurs, laughter, the clink of mugs. Life, as always, finds a way to keep ticking even when the calendar doesn't. You step inside, not because you're thirsty, but because you want to see if the barkeep will let you run a tab on a date that never happened. Who knows, maybe tonight's drink is on the 10th of September, 1752. The one you didn't get paid for. The curious case of the vanishing birthdays. You wander beyond the warm glow of the tavern and into the quieter edges of the village. The hush settles over you like a familiar blanket. The path curves lazily past a sleepy orchard where crooked apple trees doze under the moonlight. Their fruit, overripe and sagging, seems to hang mid-air in a slow-motion fall that never quite finishes. It's here you find a curious milestone, literally. A moss-covered stone marker stands beside the path, its surface chipped and softened by time, but one part remains legible. Born September 8, 1752, age always disputed. And with that, you've stumbled into tonight's most oddly tender predicament. What happens when your birthday falls during days that legally don't exist? A missing birthday might sound like the setup to a sad child's storybook, but it was a very real conundrum for anyone born in Britain or its colonies during those lost 11 days. Mainstream historical fact: when the British calendar skipped from September 2nd to September 14th in 1752, any dates in between simply ceased to exist in paper, at least. Birth certificates, baptism records, and even gravestones were affected. If you were born on September 10th, say, your official documents had nowhere to place you. Fringe historical detail: some priests and midwives unwilling to erase these lives jotted birth dates in the margins of church logs or labeled them between days, a sort of limbo time for the freshly arrived. In some cases, the parents simply chose a new birthday, usually September 14th, while in others, the child would grow up with an asterisk hovering over their identity. Imagine being that kid in school, explaining for the 15th time why no one's sure when to bring you cake, or worse, never being quite sure how old you really are. Some families took this as superstition, too. A baby born in the missing days might be considered unlucky or charmed, depending on the region. There's a recorded account of a girl named Eliza Tumbrel in rural Devonshire. Born on what would have been September 5th, her parents insisted she had second sight, because she came when time wasn't watching. Locals claimed she could predict rain with eerie accuracy, and at least one chicken reportedly followed her home daily without being asked. Scholars do still debate whether this whole birthday problem had lasting effects. Some argue it caused widespread confusion in property inheritance and legal age requirements. After all, when do you come of age if your actual birthday isn't valid? Others think it was all smoothed over fairly quickly, with most people adopting the new dates out of practicality. But for those who lived through it, the question lingered. Could you trust a calendar that told you your own birth never occurred? You glance back at the milestone stone, wondering who it belonged to. Someone who never knew which day to celebrate. Someone whose birthday was folded up and misplaced like a letter dropped behind a drawer. What songs were sung for them? What toasts were made? Or did they quietly skip it each year, like an unspoken family sadness? You stroll on through the orchard, the crunch of fallen fruit under your feet muffled by the soft hum of insects, the termite. Trees feel oddly reverent tonight, like they too remember things that aren't on any page. The stars above you blink slowly, patient as always, indifferent to what the earth does with its calendars. As you reach a fence post at the far end of the path, you spot another inscription, this one barely visible in the moonlight. It reads, "Born when no clocks ticked, still here." No name, no date, just the stubborn assertion of existence. And in that quiet phrase, you feel the pulse of every lost day, every erased name, every child born into a space the world forgot to mark. Not everyone needs a date to be remembered. Some memories live purely in the margins. The lawsuit that argued with time. You follow the fading trail from the orchard, winding down toward a cluster of ivy-covered buildings that cling to the hillside like they're trying to stay out of history's way. One of them, a narrow, leaning structure with warped shutters and crooked chimney stones, bears a sign swinging in the night breeze. It reads, "Chancery House Records. Disputes and Dust since 1710. You step inside and are immediately greeted by a scent that can only be described as powdered parchment and disappointed. Lawyers. The floors creak like old bones and shelves tower. Above you, crowded with legal tomes, scrolls tied in velvet ribbon, and an alarming number of inkwells that seem to multiply the longer you look at them. At the center of this dusty sanctuary lies the story of a man named Bartholomew Grice and the lawsuit that tried to fight a calendar. Here's tonight's mainstream historical fact. The adoption of the Gregorian calendar didn't just irritate peasants and bewildered priests, it sparked actual legal disputes. Some were about missed wages or broken marriage records, but one particularly absurd and fascinating case involved a man who sued his neighbor over a land lease that expired on the 10th day of September, 1752. Of course, that date never officially occurred. Enter Bartholomew Grice, an amateur beekeeper and professional nitpicker who believed his tenant, a man named Renly Farr, owed him an additional month of rent. Why? Because, Grice argued, if the lease expired on a non-existent day, then logically it never expired at all. Thus Farr was still on the hook. The case was filed with the local court in Wiltshire and, by all accounts, delighted the clerks and confused everyone else. Judges couldn't agree on whether to interpret the contract literally, the date no longer exists, or contextually both parties clearly meant early September. Grice arrived in court with a homemade calendar and a pile of correspondence proving that time itself was a legal tool, one that could be reinterpreted if necessary. The court, stifling laughter, dismissed his claims, but not before the case became the fringe historical detail of the decade. A man genuinely tried to argue with the fabric of time using property law. To this day, legal scholars bring up the Grice v. Farr dispute when discussing temporal loopholes in historical contracts. Some believe it laid early groundwork for the concept of good faith in legal interpretation, that is, reading contracts not as rigid commands but with reasonable understanding of intent. Others think it was just a bizarre hiccup in a chaotic month and shouldn't be overanalyzed, but here's the real kicker. Bartholomew Grice didn't stop. After losing in the local court, he sent letters to London trying to appeal. He claimed the Gregorian calendar was a foreign invention, not applicable to English earth and blood. When no one responded, he began printing pamphlets titled "Time is a Tyrant" and gave them away to confuse pedestrians. One copy still exists in the British Library, its cover adorned with an image of a sundial cracking in half. You run your hand over the desk where his case file once sat. The dust here is almost deliberate, like it's settled with intention. You can just imagine the old clerks huddled together by candlelight, reading Grice's rambling letters aloud for amusement between actual court business. "Gentlemen," one might have said, "this man has declared war on Wednesday." Outside the window, the moon casts long shadows across the hillside. Somewhere in the darkness a fox barks once and then falls silent again. You can't help but smile. Grice may have lost his case, but he won something rarer. He made his way into the margins of history through sheer stubbornness. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine him pacing his garden with a pocket watch in one hand and a ledger in the other, muttering, "I know what day it is, even if the king says otherwise." And you begin to wonder, How many other little rebellions against time have been lost to the footnotes? People who refuse to accept the version of the world handed to them because their own clocks told a different truth. You leave the Chancery House with the weight of that idea hanging gently over your shoulders. Outside, the wind picks up, scattering leaves across the path. One lands on your shoe, curling slightly like a torn calendar page. You don't brush it off. Some days, even the ones that didn't officially exist, deserve to be carried a little farther. The farmer who planted in a time that didn't count us. The stars shuffle overhead and the path narrows into a quiet patch of farmland. You start to hear the soft repetitive thump of something hitting damp soil. You follow the sound, your footsteps, silent against the dew-slicked grass, until you see him, a solitary figure with a wide-brimmed hat kneeling beside a furrow, pressing something carefully into the ground. Seeds, perhaps, or maybe ideas. You've arrived at the peculiar tale of Edmund Blythe, a turnip farmer in Norfolk, whose entire harvest once sprouted in a time that, according to the government, technically did not exist. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. In September 1752, Britain and its colonies switched from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, leaping forward 11 days to align with the rest of Western Europe. This sudden chronological shift left farmers like Edmund in a bit of a quandary, you see. Planting wasn't just a matter of habit, it followed seasonal cues, lunar cycles and traditional wisdom that dated back generations, and now, the stars and moon said it was the first week of September, but the law said it was the 14th. As for Edmund, he planted anyway, based on the moon's rise, the air's chill, and what he called the itch in my knees. He dropped his seeds into the ground on September 8, 1752. The problem was, that date had been officially erased. Which brings us to our fringe historical fact. Local tax collectors refused to log Edmund's crop in their records. According to them, the land had been idle during those lost days, and therefore he wasn't eligible for seasonal deductions. This set off a comically bureaucratic standoff. Edmund insisted he'd planted, the magistrate insisted he hadn't, because the day never existed. So Edmund, in a fit of beautifully agrarian protest, placed a scarecrow in front of the magistrate's office. But not just any scarecrow, it held a sign reading, "Planted in God's time, not yours." He even dressed it like the magistrate, which, while mildly insulting, was extremely well stitched. The matter became something of a local curiosity. Other farmers came to support Edmund, claiming that planting had always followed nature, not Parliament. A few even adjusted their own planting records to match the missing days in solidarity. Suddenly the debate grew larger. Was human time more trustworthy than natural time? That's where scholars still bicker. Some argue that this moment revealed the growing tension between bureaucratic governance and rural traditions. Others say it was simply the case of one stubborn farmer making a loud fuss over a clerical error. But the debate hasn't entirely gone away. Even today, some historians cite the Blythe incident when discussing resistance to centralized timekeeping and the lingering importance of folk calendars. You look down and imagine the rows of seeds beneath your feet, sown in defiance, watered with stubbornness. Did they grow taller because they were planted in lost time, or was that just Edmund's pride? As the wind rustles the hedges, you hear the faint creak of an old wooden wheelbarrow being pushed through the rows. You glance over and swear you see Edmund's figure trudging away, shoulders squared, hat pulled low. Maybe it's a ghost, maybe it's memory, or maybe, just maybe, it's the part of history that refuses to stay buried. Near the gate, you spot a faded sign nailed to a fence post. It reads, "Harvested in days no one believed in." You lean against the gate for a moment, letting the quiet settle. It's comforting, somehow, to know that even in the face of royal proclamations and missing calendar pages, someone chose to trust the earth. Someone decided to plant truth in the soil even if no one else was watching. You take one last look at the field where rows of invisible crops once whispered under a moon that didn't care what day it was, and then, gently, you move on. When weddings fell into the time void, the path leaves the fields behind and winds into a small village where chimneys puff soft smoke and every house leans ever so slightly inward, like old neighbors whispering secrets to one another. There's a well in the center, its stones worn smooth by centuries of calloused hands, and beside it stands a chapel quaint whitewashed, with windows that glint like half-lidded eyes trying to stay awake. You push open the crooked wooden gate and wander toward the steps, where a plaque reads, "Here, love was almost forgotten." Inside, time seems to slow even further. The pews are polished but empty. The candles have long since burned out. Yet in This chapel's archives lies one of the strangest romantic mysteries of the 18th century, the story of Marjorie Pilk and Thomas Ransom, two lovers whose wedding legally disappeared. Mainstream historical fact: when Britain transitioned to the Gregorian calendar in 1752, it wasn't just dates that got lost, it was events too. One of the more delicate disruptions involved marriages. Because marriage records were deeply tied to legal rights, inheritance, legitimacy of children, property, their erasure of 11 days caused widespread confusion. In Marjorie and Thomas's case, their wedding was scheduled for September 6th. They exchanged vows, kissed and danced well into the evening, completely unaware that in just a few days, that date would be deleted. Once the calendar jumped forward to September 14th, local church records hastily updated no longer showed their wedding. The page for their date simply didn't exist. It was as if they'd never tied the knot at all. Here comes the fringe historical detail. Their priest, Father Kembley, insisted on performing the ceremony again. He called it a renewal, though in truth, it was a bureaucratic patch job. Marjorie refused at first, declaring, "I shan't marry a man twice unless he earns it." Thomas apparently agreed, and the village was briefly consumed by gossip and laughter. For weeks they were known as the maybe married couple. Eventually they relented and held a second ceremony on October 1st. But not before the local baker gifted them a loaf of bread labeled Second Thoughts. This was no isolated incident. All across England, similar cases cropped up. Some couples married during the erased days and later found themselves unable to prove their union. Others faced inheritance issues when wills referenced dates that had ceased to exist. Legal scholars still debate how widespread the problem truly was. Some argue that most local clergy adapted quickly, scribbling footnotes or simply pretending the wedding occurred on the 14th. Others insist that hundreds of records remain incomplete or ambiguous even now. For Marjorie and Thomas, the confusion had long-lasting effects. Their first child's baptismal record lists them as unmarried at the time. Their second child's record says otherwise. By the time they reached old age, their grandchildren argued over which wedding anniversary to celebrate, September 6th or October 1st. Neither date felt entirely real anymore. You move toward the altar, where a cracked ledger rests beneath a sheet of glass. There, faint but legible, is their entry: marriage, not recorded, presumed valid. See folio 32. It's heartbreakingly vague. You wonder how many other lives exist only in the margins of officialdom. How many kisses, arguments and handholdings took place in time society no longer recognizes. The floorboards creak beneath your feet as you walk past the pews. Light filters through the stained glass, scattering color onto the stone floor. Reds, blues and greens shimmer across your boots like spilled memory. You picture Marjorie, maybe a little flushed, half amused, half irritated, telling Thomas, "If we're not married, then give me my earrings back." And Thomas, perhaps a man of few words, simply holding out his hand. Outside the chapel, the air is thick with the scent of burning oak and damp hay. A bell chimes in the distance, not from the chapel, but somewhere deeper in the village. Time ticking again, unsure whether to correct itself or just let things be. You rest your hand against the chapel wall, warm from the day's sun. It feels solid, permanent. Even if the records didn't quite keep up, love clearly did. Maybe that's the real point, that memory, like love, often lives in defiance of time. You step back into the evening, the sky bruised with the colors of twilight, and feel that same defiant warmth following you like a stubborn echo. The shopkeeper who refused to change the date to the evening deepens as you wander beyond the chapel, past a row of sleepy houses and into the oldest part of the village, a crooked alley lined with shuttered storefronts. The cobblestones beneath your feet are uneven, their edges rounded smooth by centuries of commerce. You pass a lantern hanging from an iron bracket, still unlit, and just beyond it stands a little shop with fogged-over windows and a lopsided sign that reads Chudley's Sundries and Curios, EST 1694. You push open the creaky door, and instantly the scent of beeswax, chalk, and cardamom tickles your nose. Shelves tower with glass jars, cracked clocks, ivory combs, and bundles of quill pens. It's a place where time feels confused, and perhaps deliberately so. You've stumbled into the story of Ambrose Chudley, a man who became locally infamous for one petty act of defiance, refusing to change his shop calendar after the Great Calendar Shift of 1752. Here's your mainstream historical fact. After Britain adopted the Gregorian calendar, citizens were officially told to skip ahead from September 2nd to September 14th. While this alignment brought Britain in sync with much of Europe, many Britons found it deeply unsettling. Churchgoers, farmers, and laborers alike clung to the familiar rhythm of the Julian calendar. But Ambrose, a widower with a fondness for licorice tea and wool socks, took things further than most. He simply refused to acknowledge the missing days, according to receipts, ledgers, and at least for cranky diary entries by townspeople. Ambrose continued to date his shop's transactions with Julian time, marking days that technically didn't exist. Fringe historical fact. He even made his own calendar, hand-drawn, pinned above the till, and decorated with sketches of cats and obscure saints where September had 30 full days, as if nothing had changed. Scholars still debate whether this was an act of protest, eccentricity, or sheer forgetfulness. But it had real consequences. Customers began to worry when receipts bore dates like deaths, 1752, which, according to the state, had been erased. A rumor spread that Ambrose was dabbling in forbidden time magic or attempting to defraud the crown. One particularly anxious clergyman accused him of sowing temporal confusion. A magistrate visited Ambrose, offered him toffee and showed him the calendar. He received a fine of 1 shilling and was told to conform to the present reckoning or cease trading. Naturally, Ambrose responded by raising his prices to adjust for temporal inflation. The open scholarly debate. Some historians suggest that small acts like Ambrose's show a deeper cultural resistance to imposed systems of control. They argue that by clinging to his own perception of time, he was asserting independence in an era increasingly governed by central authority. Others claim he was just stubborn and enjoyed irritating bureaucrats. Either way, Ambrose's shop became a bit of a tourist attraction in its own century. Visiting poets wrote of the shop where Thursday is still Tuesday, and schoolchildren were dared to ask for sweets dated in ghost days. Even after Ambrose died, his granddaughter Martha kept the calendar pinned up, yellowed and curled, a quiet rebellion nailed to the wall. You stand in the exact spot where Ambrose once counted coins and muttered about the tyranny of PayPal math. A dusty tin tray sits on the counter, engraved with dates that don't align. You run your finger over one, September 11th, 1752. It's oddly comforting. Outside, the village is slowly winding down. You hear the clang of a stable door, the squawk of geese settling. Time marches on. Sure, but inside this shop, it still fumbles, hesitates, rewinds. You take one last look around. On a shelf near the door, a small frame displays Ambrose's motto, scrawled in faded ink. If I must lose days, let them be rainy ones. A bell above the door jingles as you leave, and for just a second, you feel as though you've stepped back onto a street that shouldn't exist, in a time that never quite agreed with itself. The sky has darkened to a soft plum, and the air carries the scent of dried apples and old tobacco. Time, you think, might be more fragile than we pretend. And, sometimes, it just takes one woolsock shopkeeper to remind us of that. When legal documents had no birthday, you continue along the quiet village path, and the cobblestones now lead you past what was once the town's administrative officer squat. Stone structure with flaking blue shutters and a heavy oak door stained by decades of weather and arguments. The window panes are fogged with age, but through the glass, you can just barely make out shelves stacked with scrolls, dusty ledgers, and the occasional ink-blotted file that looks like it's ready to retire. Pushing the door open releases a musty breath of parchment and dried lavender, and you step inside into a forgotten world of bureaucracy. Somewhere within these records lies the strange tale of a document that legally never existed. This is the case of the non-birthday deed, a property transfer signed on September 10, 1752, a date that, as you now know, was conveniently erased when Britain leapt from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian, skipping straight from September 2nd to the 14th. The mainstream historical fact: when Britain implemented the Gregorian reform, it caused mass confusion across all kinds of official paperwork, contracts, leases, wills, and legal deeds. The law technically recognized the shift, but local officials, clerks, and registrars often didn't know how to respond in practice. Into this administrative muddle stepped one Barnabas Finch, a retired barrister who wished to transfer ownership of his small estate complete with 2 cows, a chicken coop, and a cider press to his nephew Henry. The deed was signed, witnessed, and sealed on what the local registry office recorded as September 10, 1752. Unfortunately, that date no longer existed on the official calendar, and the regional clerk, a particularly nervous man named Osbert Crumb, refused to file the deed. "We do not process ghosts," he reportedly muttered. Fringe historical fact. Osbert, fearing legal repercussions, locked the document in his personal filing drawer rather than destroy it. Over the years, The drawer came to be known in whispers as the limbo drawer, a place where inconvenient documents were placed when no one knew quite what to do with them. It wasn't until nearly 2 decades later, in 1771, that Henry Finch discovered the problem. By then, Barnabas had long passed, the estate was producing apples regularly, and Henry had raised 3 children in the house. But when he attempted to sell the property, the records showed no proof of ownership. "It is as though you simply began squatting," one official told him. Naturally, Henry was appalled, and more naturally still, he sued. Thus began the infamous case of Finch v. the Calendar, an absurdly tedious legal battle that dragged on for 3 years and is still studied today by legal historians with a fondness for antiquated absurdity. The open scholarly debate. Some say the court eventually ruled in Henry's favor simply to end the embarrassment. Others argue it set a precedent that any action taken in the lost days could be legally rehabilitated if multiple living witnesses attested to it. Still others believe the ruling was purposefully vague to avoid setting a binding precedent, which ironically only increased the confusion for future cases. One particularly poetic historian described the affair as a war waged between ink and time itself. You browse the dusty shelves and find a replica of the infamous deed. Its ink faded and margins annotated with increasingly desperate notes in different handwriting. Near the top, in Osbert Crumb's stiff script, is a single comment: "Should I pretend it was signed earlier, or later, or not at all?" The document is dated clearly, September 10, 1752, a legal non-birthday. The air inside the room is hushed, like it remembers all the grumbles, footsteps, and groans of officials who once paced the floor in confusion. It's strangely soothing, a place where even bureaucracy feels sleepy. As you turn to leave, you notice a small wooden drawer labeled Misk 1752. Curiosity gets the better of you, and you tug it open. Inside, curled and yellowed, are dozens of other lost day documents, rent receipts, marriage intentions, one incredibly detailed order for a dozen embroidered waistcoats, all of them dated in the days the world decided not to keep, all of them waiting to be believed. You step outside again into the cool evening, and the wind picks up just enough to ruffle your sleeves. You think of Henry Finch, sitting in court, day after day, trying to explain that, yes, something very real happened, just on a day that didn't officially exist. It's the kind of nonsense only history can make serious, and the kind of seriousness that makes history wonderfully absurd. Farmers who refuse to harvest future apples. As the last bit of sunlight fades and the stars begin to prick through the velvet of night, your path veers off from the cobbled lanes and drifts into softer terrain, pasture land, fields and fruit-laden orchards blanketed in the aroma of ripe apples and freshly turned earth. You walk along a narrow dirt trail hemmed in by crumbling stone walls, the kind built by generations of hands with no more to just instinct, patience, and stubbornness. The wind carries the mellow tang of fermenting cider and hay, and somewhere nearby, a cow sighs heavily, as if exasperated by human foolishness, which, as it turns out, is an excellent mood for tonight's rural tale, The Great Future. Apple Rebellion of 1752. You wouldn't survive this one, by the way, not because of hardship, but because your patience would snap trying to explain time reform to a man who thinks his apples ripened in the future. Let's get to it. The mainstream historical fact: Britain's shift to the Gregorian calendar not only skipped 11 days, it also shifted the perceived seasons. For centuries, under the Julian system, farmers had tied their planting, pruning, and harvesting schedules to feast days and saints' days. Michaelmas meant harvest, Candlemas meant sowing. When the reform dropped days from the calendar, many rural communities, especially in the West Country and parts of Wales and Scotland, believed the government had literally stolen time from nature. The apples, they said, were not ready. Fringe historical detail. In Devon, several orchards refused to harvest their apples on the new schedule. They insisted the fruit wasn't properly blessed, hadn't soaked up its full quota of daylight, and was therefore time-stunted. In particular, the orchard of one Gideon Hale became the site of a small but stubborn act of agricultural protest. Gideon, a deeply religious man who'd once tried to convert a scarecrow, declared that if God had meant apples to ripen by the 14th, he wouldn't have created the Julian calendar in the first place. His workers followed suit. Some even wore little tokens carved with the original Julian dates, hung around their necks like time medals. They kept to the old calendar and left their apples hanging, despite them beginning to drop, bruise, and attract local pigs. The open scholarly debate. Some historians view these protests as sincere expressions of religious and temporal confusion. Others suggest it was more economic. Farmers didn't want to sell produce early and risk being undercut by buyers who claimed it wasn't ripe enough. A few scholars even argue that landlords used the chaos to force new terms onto tenant farmers by exploiting calendar loopholes, demanding rent on days that technically no longer existed, thus increasing profit under the guise of law. In Gideon's case, the refusal reached near farcical levels. When his neighbor's workers harvested early and began selling cider in October, Gideon accused them of offending the calendar and bottling fruit from hell. He led a small procession through the village waving a stick shaped like an hourglass and chanting, "Time is not a feather you can pluck." Needless to say, no one quite knew how to respond. Even local officials seemed reluctant to interfere because they didn't understand the new calendar rules themselves, and partly because they found the whole thing mildly entertaining. For months, Gideon refused to touch a single apple. When winter finally arrived and most of the fruit had rotted or been eaten by animals, he claimed it was a sign from God that the nation had sinned by meddling with divine rhythms. Still, he held a feast that December using apples he found intact, which he called resurrection fruit. You pause by a low stone wall and spot one of those old apple trees. Its limbs twist like arthritic fingers, its bark gnarled and cracked, but at the very top, a few apples cling stubbornly to their stems. You imagine Gideon standing here, arms crossed, muttering about how these apples were born in one calendar and would die in another. Time for him was not abstract. It was tangible, edible even, and it could spoil. This orchard, long since returned to more obedient seasonal schedules, still carries a quiet resistance in the way its trees lean toward the sun just a little slower than they ought to. The wind stirs again, this time sweeter, almost cider-like. You sit for a moment beneath the branches, wondering how many fruit pickers argued over dates, how many landowners sneered at their tenants' superstitions, and how many harvests were lost not to weather, but to the weight of unseen time. The moon climbs higher, casting dappled light across the orchard. Somewhere out there in the dark, you swear you hear a voice. "We pick when God says, not when Parliament snaps its fingers." You smile. Gideon would have liked that. When the tax collector missed a deadline that didn't exist, you leave the orchard behind and follow a gentle curve in the path that leads you toward a row of low stone buildings, long abandoned workhouses perhaps, or communal storage halls, where dried grain once rustled in the beams above and stray cats padded between sacks of barley. But tonight, they are silent. Moonlight slips through broken slats, highlighting old crates and brittle ledger books, whose ink has bled into parchment. You duck beneath a crooked doorframe into one such building, and there, perched atop a splintered wooden stool, sits a ledger left open on a page marked September 13th, 1752, a date that never officially happened. And yet, here it is. Welcome to the story of the tax collector who missed his deadline because the deadline, technically, didn't exist. This curious figure was one Edmund Tolliver, an otherwise methodical man with a love for rules, straight lines, and firm shoe buckles. He collected property taxes in a coastal county in southern England, and was known for being punctual, humorless, and utterly lacking imagination, a perfect fit for his job. The mainstream historical fact here is this. During the calendar change, in 1752, Britain moved directly from September 2nd to September 14th, eliminating 11 days from official records, but the government didn't fully anticipate the logistical chaos this would cause in routine bureaucratic processes like tax collection. Entered the fringe historical wrinkle. Edmund's district had a local tax code requiring that all landowners submit their payments no later than the 13th day of September, yearly, without exception. Well, in 1752, there was number 13th of September. But no one told Edmund, or perhaps more accurately, Edmund refused to believe that the date had been erased. He waited at his desk all day on September 13th, which again, didn't exist. More irritated by the hour as no one came to submit their payments, not a single knock on the office door. No jingling coin purses, no grumbling tenant farmers. Just an eerie silence and the occasional sea breeze sneaking through a cracked window. According to his personal journal preserved in an attic box, discovered in 1911, he wrote, "I have never seen such a flagrant violation of civic duty. Not one among them has the moral fiber to attend to the schedule. This is precisely what happens when one disturbs the divine order of the calendar." Edmund filed non-payment penalties against every landowner in the county. The fines were steep. Outrage erupted. Farmers swore they couldn't pay taxes on a day that had vanished. Merchants protested that the official almanacs made no mention of an obligation, and one clergyman declared the fines blasphemous time fraud. This led to a legal showdown that, while not quite as dramatic as Finch v. The calendar, did drag on long enough to be referenced in several law journals. The open scholarly debate around the Tolliver incident centers on whether Edmund truly misunderstood the reform or if he saw an opportunity to impose penalties for personal gain. Some argue he was merely enforcing what had been written, no matter how absurd it became post-reform. Others point to subtle changes in his handwriting, around that period wobblier, angrier, as evidence of a nervous breakdown fueled by administrative helplessness. One even suggests that Tolliver believed skipping 11 days was a sin, and that those who accepted the change were living in a state of moral decay, whether fueled by piety, pedantry, or opportunism. Edmund's actions had consequences. The Crown eventually nullified the fines, but not before several smallholder farmers sold livestock to try and pay them. Years later, Edmund Tolliver was quietly reassigned to a remote district known for frequent flooding and almost no taxable landed emotion masked as promotion. His name faded from public record, except in that one journal, now kept in a weather-controlled drawer in an archival basement. You peer over the open ledger in the silent building. The page reads, September 13, 1752. No collections made. Proceed with fines. The ink is dark, deliberate, and underlined twice. You imagine Edmund sitting in this very chair, waiting all day for people who would never come. He might have muttered to himself. He probably realigned his quills. Perhaps he tapped the table in escalating frustration as the shadows grew longer and longer, confused why the village felt so empty. You can almost hear him now. They'll all be here after lunch, I'm certain, any minute now. The weight of bureaucracy is heavy and sometimes hilarious. You step back into the night, leaving the ghost of Tolliver to his vigil. The stars are bright now, clustered like ink blots spilled across a vellum sky. The moon has shifted slightly west, and the wind is cooler, brushing your cheek like the pages of forgotten law. Somewhere behind you a floorboard creaks, perhaps the old tax collector, still convinced someone owes him a shilling. The clockmaker who refused to move time. You wander past the old ledger hole and down a cobblestone alley that seems unusually straight, almost unnaturally so. The stones are set with odd precision, and overhead, you spot a metal bracket hanging empty, the sort that once held a sign. You follow the path until you see it, a narrow shop with a warped glass window, its panes misted with the breath of centuries. You lean close and read the faded lettering etched above the door. Bartleby Clenn, horologist extraordinaire. You've reached the workshop of the clockmaker who refused to move time. And really, who can blame him? It's not every day the government asks you to lie to your clocks. Tonight's final tale wraps us in the quiet ticking heart of the 1752 calendar, reformed through the eyes of a man whose entire identity was bound to precise hours, gear ratios, and seconds so smooth you could balance a thimble of tea on them. Bartleby Clenn wasn't just a clockmaker, he was the clockmaker of his village, renowned for fixing French bracket clocks, tower bell mechanisms, and even a rogue sundial that refused to agree with its neighbors. He was meticulous, eccentric, and deeply offended by people who said half past instead of 30 minutes past the hour. So when Parliament decreed that 11 days would simply not exist, Bartleby did the one thing that made perfect sense to him. He refused. Mainstream fact: when Britain adopted the Gregorian calendar, civil society had to adapt, not just with paperwork but also in physical timekeeping. Public clocks had to be adjusted, almanacs were reprinted. Some village clocks even bore tiny placards declaring, adjusted for Gregorian compliance. Bartleby Clenn scoffed at these signs. In his view, time was not a social contract, it was a measurable, mechanical fact. You cannot delete 11 days. You can't cheat the sun. Fringe detail: Bartleby secretly built a duplicate of the town clock tower mechanism hidden in his back room and kept it running on Julian time. It ticked 11 days behind the rest of the world, but perfectly in tune with the old rhythms. He called it the honest clock, and according to letters found decades later, he used it to host time-correct suppers every September 3rd through 13th, inviting close friends to toast to the days stolen by parliamentary mischief. He even developed a secondary system of pocket watches, one set to official Gregorian time, the other to Bartleby time. This led to occasional chaos in the village. There are court records noting a man who missed his wedding because his Bartleby watch said he was early. Another case involves a schoolboy who claimed he wasn't late for lessons, he was Julian punctual. These incidents were minor, yet amusing enough to make it into regional newspapers. But the scholarly debate, it centers around a curious local legend that Bartleby Clenn altered not just clocks but the village's entire social rhythm. According to oral histories, some families quietly observed both calendars for years. They celebrated birthdays twice, hosted festivals on the forgotten days, and tracked planting schedules based on Bartleby's secret charts. Some say it was harmless eccentricity. Others argue it revealed the fragility of temporal authority, when a single man, armed with gears and conviction, could maintain a competing timeline. What did that say about the nature of time itself? Was it truly linear, or was it elastic, communal, and vulnerable to protest? You press your hand against the shop's weathered door, and though no one has entered for centuries, it creaks open as if waiting for you. Inside, the walls are covered with clock faces, none of them moving. In the center of the room stands one remaining mechanism, still ticking. It clicks in a rhythm that feels off until you realize it's 11 days behind. You stand perfectly still, listening. The seconds fall like water droplets into a deep basin. Tick, tick, tick. There's something reverent about it, something stubborn and serene. Bartleby's tools lie neatly arranged on the workbench, brass calipers, a magnifying loupe, and a small stack of parchment. The top sheet bears a simple message, scrawled in tight angular script. Time is not theirs to steal. You imagine him there, candlelight flickering on his spectacles, as he adjusted each wheel and gear to hold the past in place. Not out of nostalgia, but principle. Outside, the modern world marched forward, but here, time had dug in its heels. The room feels warmer now, as if Bartleby's defiance still lingers in the wood and glass. You step back into the alley and listen to the faint hum of the wind against the rooftops. The stars overhead remain unbothered by calendars or disputes. Their time is measured in millennia, in burning hydrogen and silent gravity. But down higher among people with birthdays and deadlines, time can be won or lost in the flick of a parliamentary quill. You glance back at the shop. The door swings shut with a gentle thud. Bartleby Clen, wherever he is, would be pleased to know you came.